All right, hello everybody, welcome. My name is Rachel Fowler-Neufeld. I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson in Saskatoon. I'd firstly like to acknowledge that we're streaming from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. On behalf of McNally Robinson, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the virtual launch of Prairie Grass. Tonight's event is co-presented by BWL Publishing. We're so pleased to have Joan Soggie here with us tonight. And we're also joined by a special guest, Sandra Fowler, who will be chatting with Joan this evening. And although tonight's event is virtual, you can still purchase physical copies of Prairie Grass either online, and I'll put the link in the chat on the side there, or you can give us a call and pick up a copy in store. You'll also notice that there's a Q&A button on your screen, so feel free to use this function. It's just at the bottom to submit your questions at any point, and then a little bit later on, we'll have time to answer some of those questions. So I think first I'm going to introduce Joan. Joan Soggie is a lifelong Saskatchewan prairie dweller. She lives and writes in the village of Elbow on Lake Diefenbaker. Living all her life in the prairies has led her to explore the many mysteries that cloud our past. The organic relationship between the land and its people was a theme of her nonfiction regional history book, Looking for Iktah. And this theme carries throughout her quintessentially Saskatchewan historical novel, Prairie Grass. So welcome, Joan. Thanks for being here with us tonight. I'm also going to introduce Sandra, and then they're going to get into the reading and conversation portion of the evening. Sandra Fowler is from Eyebrow, which is just down the road from Elbow, where Joan resides. Sandra and her husband, John, operate a livestock operation, and their land is mostly grassland and includes some native prairie. Sandra worked for 9 years for the farm stress line, and as a mature student went back to university at the age of 50, receiving her Bachelor of Social Work degree the same day as her oldest daughter received her degree, which is very cool. Until she retired, Sandra worked for the Five Hills Health Region as an assessor coordinator for home care, long-term care. And she also loves to read both fiction and nonfiction, and historical fiction is a special love of Sandra's, so she is thrilled with Joan's book and is hopefully going to tell us a little bit more about that in just a moment. So welcome, Sandra. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Well, this is great. Joan and I, when we get together, always have a great conversation. And so this is just a little bit different way of doing it, but I'm sure it'll be fun and a little bit of learning for us both.
Sure.
Joan, I love the way your love of the land comes through in your books. Could you tell me a little bit about how your interest in history and the land, the prairies, where it came from, and if you've always had it or if it's sort of new?
I think it's something that I grew up with, Sandra. It's just living on a farm a long ways from town and right at the edge of the big hills, which were held all kinds of mystery, and there were coyotes up there, there were antelopes. Every once in a while we'd hear there was a cougar in the area. And it was always, the land always seemed fascinating and exciting to me. Everything that happened that was important happened out in the country, and that was our small world. The farm work, the animals, the roaming in the hills was the favorite thing that my sister and brothers and I used to do. And it was something you took for granted. You loved it, but you took it for granted the way you take your parents for granted. And it wasn't. Grew up a little bit and moved away and went to university and then was working, and that I really began to miss the land, just being closer to the land. And then I married a farmer and moved to Elbow. I grew up at Beachy, a town where it's on the other side of the lake. And Beachy is kind of a western town. And our farm ranch was 13 miles west of town, right at the edge of the Matador Ranch. And so ranching and farming went together. They were uh, part of the world, as far as I was concerned, part of the normal world. And
Mhm.
it grew from there. And as far as the
Okay.
interest in history, I think that too came from growing up on the land and knowing that other people had lived there long before my grandparents homesteaded that land, but we knew so little about them. So the curiosity was there and the need to know, and then discovering that what I could learn, but seemed so limited, and it was so frustrating to not have that, be able to actually find out what was going on. And now it says my internet connection is unstable. Yes. I think would you talk for a minute? I think I have to go and ask my husband to put his phone on mute.
Okay, sure. Well, Joan and I always get together, and when we chat, it seems like we start out and suddenly an hour and a half has gone by. So she has done so much interesting history. And because I don't live too far away, we kind of are interested in the same area of the province. And it's quite interesting. So she has lots of stuff to tell, and I just love her book because you can just feel like you're there. It's she knows the grasses and she knows the birds, and her book, because she knows the land so well, she also is very good about explaining it in her book. So Joan, tell me a little bit about your research that you did. So I know that you know things that happened before you were around. And how did you go about finding all this interesting stuff that's the background for your book?
Yeah, I just had to unmute.
Okay.
Well, I've got the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society to thank for that. I
Mhm.
met a few people who belonged to the society, and then I thought, this is the kind of information I really, really am curious about and I want to learn more about. So I joined the society, and then I met people who told me, oh, Elbo's a wonderful place to find information about, because it
Mhm.
was always mentioned in the writing of the early explorers.
Mm.
Anyone that traveled through the area would mention the trails crossed here, and it was it was a boundary area, and it was always mentioned. Whereas the area that I grew up in was less
Mm.
less frequently traveled, and by explorers. I'm sure it
Mhm.
was not. It was a great area for the Indigenous people who were living here, but it wasn't right on. It wasn't easy to get to for anyone
Mm.
coming with on an expedition for the
Mm.
government or the Hudson's Bay Company.
Mm.
So I began exploring those, and um, was just astounded at the stories that I could find, and became so excited about them that I wanted to tell everyone about all these wonderful stories that I found out about right here. It happened right here. And that was so exciting to me. And of course, I thought the kids would be interested. So I was always telling my kids. And then when I was working at the school, well, I'd often tell stories to the kids there when they came into the library.
Mm.
And it just grew from there. Thought I have to stop trying to tell everybody these stories. I can't I can't keep well, like my daughter said she remembered doing this one time. I said, so I'd be telling a story and they'd just walk away. And she said, yeah, I remember doing that. But if I write a
Well,
story, then you can read it, and you can put it down if you don't want to read it. You
yeah,
don't have me nattering at you. So that's the advantage of having
a book.
being able to write it. Yeah.
Your first book was a nonfiction book, and now
Mhm.
you've decided to write fiction. So tell me a little bit about why why you've decided to write a different genre and just how it was different.
Yeah. Well, one thing that isn't different is that I did just as much research for the fiction book as I did for the nonfiction. It took every bit as much research to do that, and maybe even more. The one reason that I didn't do it as nonfiction was that after writing Looking for Ektow and going over and over and over the footnotes, which I hadn't done since my university days, uh, I just didn't want to ever go through that again. Footnotes and getting everything just right. Um, but that was I knew the research was an important part of whatever I was doing. I wanted it to be as authentic as possible. But at the same time, there was so much that when I wanted to write the Indigenous and the Métis story, to have that included in the whole story, because the story is it just isn't complete without that.
Yes.
There was so much that I couldn't find out, so much that I wouldn't know, and even with the settler story, there's so much that you can't tell as nonfiction, but you can tell as fiction.
Mm,
And so in some ways it can be truer than nonfiction because you can tell more of the story because your characters are fictitious
mhm,
and it's not going to affect any family
mhm,
or
mhm.
individual.
So you sort of fill in some blanks that
Right.
aren't there when you're doing research about nonfiction.
Yeah.
Hmm, good. I love some of the little details in your book, Joan. Just the little things, and I'm not sure where they came from. For instance, a very brief thing about the woman, about how tough it was for settler women there, and I thought that just added so much to the story. It's only a couple of paragraphs, and the other story about churches, how there was conflict with churches. Where did you make up all that stuff or
It all happened. Sadly.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's another of the stories that I grew up with. No, it wasn't something that was talked about a lot, but we all grew up knowing um, that grandma and grandpa had that life had been very hard, that
Mm,
they had well, it wasn't all that much different for my parents actually, when
ah,
as a child, and as a child you don't um I mean, when I was a child, their life was very hard, and we still didn't have running water, electricity, phones, good roads,
mhm,
nothing. You were on your own, and for life and death situations, or just for fun, just for getting through a long winter,
mhm,
and they did it superbly.
hmm,
And you knew that it was the sort of thing, again, that you take for granted as a child, but then looking back over the years, you realize how hard it was and how wonderful it really was that they could do
mhm,
that. And
mhm,
that, in turn, I think gives me more appreciation for the Indigenous people who lived here for 10,000 years before, who had
mm,
no telephone, no roads, no running water,
yes.
and only what they could make and gather and produce with their own hands. And yet they worked together and they looked after each other. And I think in
Mhm,
lots of cases they had a pretty good life.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, Joan. Well, you were going to do some reading. I'll turn it over to you and you can do a few readings for us.
All righty. I'm going to start out at the beginning of the book, which is a good place to start. Chapter 1. And this, I'll just tell you a little bit about the story, that it's going to go back and forth through time. So I'm going to read an excerpt from 2012, and then I'm going to nip back a few years and read something from 1915. And while I'm reading, Rachel is going to put some pictures on the screen, a slideshow that Lori, my daughter, put together for me. Thank you, Lori. And the pictures are very special. They're just a few of three of them are illustrations that are in the book. My wonderful granddaughter, Saskia, drew illustrations for me for several of the chapters. I'd started doing the illustrations myself because I wanted to have little pictures of different prairie grasses and flowers to start each chapter. And so Saskia did those for me. And the other pictures are just landscape pictures of the Great Plains that I love. And my son's bison. Okay, here's chapter 1, Gabby, 2012. The old man spoke softly. I leaned forward in my chair, straining to catch his words. There's one thing you have to understand before any of this can make sense to you, he said. Your generation thinks it all began with the towns, the railroads, or the homesteaders, the pioneers. When he spoke that last word, his mouth twitched as though he wanted to grin or belch. He took another rasping breath, and his words took on a stronger emphasis. But you got to remember this. Before anything else, there was the land. He droned on, almost in a monotone. If there was anything worth listening to, I could catch up on it later when I reviewed the recording. I tuned out and let my mind drift as I studied the wrinkled old man sitting in the wheelchair before me. His back was bent, his arms ropey with hardened sinews under the age spots. The land had certainly left its mark on him, on those still calloused hands and arthritic joints and etched wrinkles, just as he and others like him had marked the land with their fields and fences and roads. Mr. Tollerud agreed to this interview willingly. He said to me the stories he wanted to tell were history, not just his personal story. Any private doubts I had about the importance of this project were not held by Eric Tollerud. For me, it was a job that gave me freedom to write, maybe to nudge my career path in a new direction. Anyway, it would look good on a resume. For him, it obviously meant a lot more. My problem would not be, as some of my associates had complained of their subjects, in getting him to talk. I guess my biggest difficulty would be in getting him to talk about what the Centenarian Project wanted to hear. The mandate was clear. After Diane verified the dozen centenarians whose names we had been given were all, in fact, a century old, and that they and their families were willing and able to participate, she gave each of us the names of 2 or 3 with whom we were to conduct interviews over the next weeks. Mr. Tollerud's was the first name she had provided me with. This was now the second interview, and it seemed the old fellow had decided to take control of the process himself. Without waiting for me to begin asking our list of carefully prepared questions, how would you describe the ethnicity of your family? When did they come to Canada? He had launched into his own narrative. You want to hear about the old days, the pioneer days. Well, my folks were pioneers, and since I came to this country with them, I guess that makes me a pioneer in a way too. And let me tell you, anyone who thinks that this land was just given away to us doesn't know a thing. The government didn't give away anything, except maybe to the railways. Homesteaders could be dried out or hailed out, lose all their cattle to a killing storm, or all their children to bad water. It didn't matter a whit to the government of the day. And then he goes on to describe more about how the homesteaders, all the regulations the homesteaders had to go through in order to gain their land. And I'm going to stop reading there, I think. That gives a little bit of a picture of who Eric Tollerud was and who Gabby is. But now Gabby is a young millennial, comes from Eastern Canada, new to the prairies, and I modeled her partly after my granddaughters. I hope they don't mind me saying that, but just smart young women who love a little bit of adventure and are really looking for answers about things. Very, very open to their surroundings and to learning new things. And that's the way Gabby is. She comes to this prairie country, which is quite different from the area that she grew up in. And she had her last year of university here and is now working this summer project with the Centenarian Project. And part of the reason the story is set in 2012 is because that's when the Truth and Reconciliation hearings were in Saskatchewan. And she attends the Truth and Reconciliation hearings as part of her background learning. So this is the day that she's heading off to the hearings, and she doesn't get there in the part that I'm going to read, but it gives you a little bit of a picture of her. This is also Gabby, 2012, chapter 4. And Andy is her boyfriend. Andy did agree to come with me, but only part way. He offered to drive for the first 70 miles while I caught up in my sleep. I woke up when the truck came to a stop and opened my eyes to a landscape of purple hills and yellowish white cliffs following away to the lake's blue a few hundred meters below. I tried to keep the surprise out of my voice. I was still annoyed he'd refused to come with me to the hearings, to listen to a bunch of senile old whiners complain about what happened 100 years ago, as he put it. Don't you ever get tired of climbing around those hills? I asked, pretending to yawn. I would have given anything almost to be going with him. No more than you get tired of hearing old guys drone on, he mocked. In fact, I believe he enjoyed stories of olden days almost as much as I did. It was the inactivity he despised. Man of action, this boyfriend of mine, all week on horseback or hiking the pasture land adjacent to the great sandhills. Part of a team commissioned by an oil company to do the required survey of possible archaeological sites prior to drilling. Then, come weekend, he changed venue and, leaving the tools of his trade behind, donned the same boots and knapsack he'd used all week and headed off to explore any quarter section a farmer or rancher would open to him. It was from one of them that he'd heard about these sandstone cliffs before us. I knew he was champing at the bit to explore them, but first he had to explain to me the labyrinth of trails needed to get me back to the main road. Never mind, he said finally, after I'd asked him for the second time whether by turning north he meant going right or left. Just follow this track to the Hutterite colony. See those white buildings off in the distance? Then keep the sun on your right until you hit the highway. Turn on the GPS so you can find your way back this afternoon. I waved him an airy goodbye from the driver's seat. Don't fall off one of those cliffs and break your neck now, I warned, imitating his mother's irritating voice. Don't you fall in love with one of your old guys and forget to come back for me. He kissed me, grabbed his knapsack off the floor, and was gone, his long-legged, loose-jointed walk carrying him out of sight over the crest of the hill. Okay, that gives you a little bit more of an idea what Gabby was like. Now I'd like to turn to the the Métis section, and there's a whole big story about how that comes into the book. So we're jumping way ahead to page 158, and this is introducing Jean-Jacques, our major Métis character, in the year 1841. Jean-Jacques, 1841. The screeching of wooden-wheeled Red River carts, the clatter and excitement of activity all around him. Those were among his first memories. Jean-Jacques was born to the people of the Buffalo. When he was 3 years old, his dark-eyed mother rolled their necessary personal belongings into a leather-bound bundle, boosted him into his father's wagon, and launched him on his first hunt. The Métis carts numbered in the hundreds. Gophers and jackrabbits 20 miles away dived for cover at the screech of their wheels. In that 1841 hunt, 1,000 buffalo were killed in one day. After 2 months of alternating intense excitement with monotonous labor, hectic activity by day and nights filled with campfire conversation and laughter, the main body of the camp turned their laden wagons onto the long trail home, Red River. They took with them their hard-earned bounty of hides, dried meats, and pemmican. They left behind piles of fly-covered buffalo bones and stone cairns marking the graves of 5 Métis who had been killed by a lightning strike on the open plain. One of them was Jean-Jacques' father. His mother, her face and hands smeared with mourning ash, gathered her bundle and prepared to return with her son to her first people. She determined to seek refuge with her brother's band, despite warnings from Métis hunters that the Cree encampments along the Saskatchewan River's North Branch had recently been targeted by Blackfoot attacks. But at the last minute, a leather-faced Métis bachelor, desire overcoming his immense taciturnity and his own grief at the death of his dear friend and comrade, approached this woman whom he had observed with an approving eye for her clever way with leather work and her neat, lithe shape, and presented himself as an alternative. The small boy, Jean-Jacques, may have played a part in this marriage of delayed longing and practical necessity. While Pierre had kept a carefully nonchalant demeanor in the presence of the young woman the Métis called Virginie, his laughter always flowed like a warm river around the small, bright-eyed boy who already showed a calculated audacity of spirit. So although Jean-Jacques could dimly recall in later years the heavy smell and the thrumming noise of his first great summer hunt, the most vivid sensations conjured by his memory were confusion and excitement, and then a feeling of loss, quickly swallowed up by the comforting reassurance of another solid presence. That presence became the foundation which lent security to all his childhood adventures. In later years, his awareness of the support of a knowing and wise being never quite left him. If he had tried to explain that feeling, he might have given it different names at different times in his life. But in those early years, he would have named it Pierre. Okay, I'll stop reading there. So,
Okay. So thank you, Joan. Do you have any other comments you want to make on that, or are we ready to accept questions from folks?
well, I'd just like to explain that as the reason the Métis who enters the story as a small boy, and well, the whole process of going back into the history to get the background and the information for putting together a book like this was, I think, in a lot of ways, it felt like an archaeological dig. You take off layer by layer by layer, and every layer is hiding something beneath it. And it's what's beneath it that is supporting the layer that you're taking off. And so that's the way I felt about the history that I uncovered gradually. And that's the way I wanted the story to feel too. And so we do go back gradually, and sometimes going back and forth between present and past. But the past is uncovered gradually in stories and bits and pieces of information until finally the whole picture becomes evident. At least I hope it does.
Yeah, that's
As
great.
much as we can know it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's great. So we're also now going to invite folks, if they have questions for Joan, to just send them in. There's a Q&A on the bottom of your screen. And so if you just will type them in, and Rachel will give them to me, and we'll discuss it. But Joan, tell me a little bit about your writing. You know, and even in the readings, it's obvious that you have all these interesting stories that you share. Some of them you said you learned from growing up, but I think you've done lots of research and so how is your writing? What is your writing sort of the way you do it? Do you just sit down and write, or do you have a time each day when you write, or do you do a lot of research and then write, or do you write and then find you need to do some more research? Can you tell us a little bit about the mechanics of putting a book together?
Well, it's a pretty haphazard process for me, I'm afraid. I've when I first started putting together the stories for Looking for Ectal, it was just a matter of trying to write them so that I could tell them to the kids or to tell them to someone in a coherent way, and to get it straight in my own mind too, because sometimes there was a bit of detective work involved, because each of the stories there were multiple sources, and you had to weed through and try to find out what was the most accurate interpretation of all of this. And then putting them together, I sent some of those were published in online and in folklore, and it was only almost as an afterthought that I thought, oh, they have to all go together. They have to all, this one would make a lot more sense if you knew this as well. And so I wanted to put them all together in a book. And so that was a real learning process, how to go about that. And that one I self-published, and decided that it was a wonderful experience and a whole lot more fun than I ever expected it to be, because suddenly you get people who, well, like you, who read the stories and you relate to them, you like them, and we can talk about it, and I find out that there's all these people that have the same passion that I have for understanding the land and understanding the history and knowing the place that we live in a better way. And it's so rewarding to meet people, to hear from readers, to get to talk to people about things, learn more from them all the time. I mean, I think every story that I've got in there has come from somebody that I've been talking to at some point, and they've given me some wonderful idea or bit of information or nugget of history that I would have discovered without them.
Yeah.
And so the sources for prairie grass are so multiple, so varied. There is a song that my grandmother made for my dad, and now I find out from my cousin, who's my dad's sister, that she made a slightly different version of the same song for her mother, which is so wonderful. And I never knew that. I only knew the version that she'd given my dad, but she wrote the music and the words herself. And it was a song that we were all taught. And I think most of my cousins were taught by their parents. And it was such a wonderful, the it was such a wonderful thing for a pioneer mother to be doing. I mean, here she was living in a sod shack with babies and toddlers and trying to keep people clean and healthy, and knowing the kind of person she was, her standards would be high, even in a sod shack with dirt floor.
Uh,
And yet she took time to make a song to sing to them, a special song about something that they knew about. And so that I love to be able to use that song in the book. And
mhm.
so,
Yeah, and it fits, you've
you know,
woven it
everything
in
from my
so nicely.
grandmother to my granddaughter, my granddaughter Ella did some proofreading for me, especially the parts to do with Gabby, because I was very,
Mm.
uh, I mean, I'm a long ways from I know them as my darling grandchildren, but not what it's really like to be one. And
Okay,
so I had to have some expert feedback on that. So there's
okay.
so
So
many
we have some
sources.
questions.
Oh, good.
We have a question from D-Bird. When do you expect your next book? Will history and family background play in it also?
Yes, it definitely will. And I'm working on it now. I'm struggling with chapter 17, which is a very difficult one for me to do. And this one I'm doing much more methodically than I did Prairie Grass, which was reworked backwards to forwards four times, I think. This one, it's only my third time. And it's going to be historic fiction, but based on a real character that I'm not trying to change anything. I'm using everything that I found out about her and her family. And I've made up some things because you have to fill in, of course,
Mhm.
but it will be fiction, but it will be based on my husband's grandmother's life. So
Ah,
it goes back to the 1800s
any idea
and
when it'll be out? How close
well,
is it?
it 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 might be out. I don't think it'll be out until next year.
Hmm. Okay, we'll look forward to it.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Rick Book. Can you talk about the relationships you developed with Métis and or Aboriginal people as part of your research?
Oh, that's a hard one. Friendships came a long time before the research, for sure. And there again, it was living where we do in this part of Saskatchewan. We don't see much evidence of Indigenous culture, or we
Mhm.
every time we go to Saskatoon, we drive through um, the
Whitecap.
Dakotas, the Whitecap
Mm.
First Nation Reserve, and that's as close as I ever came for a long time. And then there were some friendships that developed, especially through the Archaeological Society. And Dorothy Bird has been wonderful. She's gotten us to come to a powwow,
Mm.
and um, there's just so much that we can learn just by talking with people. I've discovered you meet Métis and Indigenous people everywhere, and don't even, unless there's a reason to start discussing something, you're not even aware of it. But when we do sit down, I remember sitting at a with a woman at well, I think it was probably the Archaeological Society annual meeting down at Cypress Hills, and we were sitting at the same table, and she was telling me that she had not known until she was grown up that she was Métis, because her
Mm.
mother had been afraid that she would be, I don't know, treated differently. if
Mm.
if she knew and if others knew. And so she had grown up not knowing that she was Métis, and she was just so glad to be able to embrace that part of her heritage now. And I wondered how many other people grew up like that. I've met others since then who've said the same thing. And I think any of us who have lost our heritage and then rediscovered it find that our lives are so much richer. And
Mhm.
anyway, that doesn't really answer your question. Rick, I'm so glad you're here, Rick, if you're still listening after all that.
Yes, well, I've been to some of the archaeological things, and I can see how you just relate well to everybody, and so yeah, it's exciting to hear people's stories and get to know their perspective for sure. So that's all we have for questions, Joan. So we're going to start to wind up now. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you'd like to comment on right now?
I'd just like to thank everybody who is listening tonight or who will listen later on. And thank you so much, Sandra. You are such a wonderful, wonderful friend and help
Oh, you're welcome.
to help with this. And to Rachel and McNally Robinson and EWL Publishing. I'm grateful for all of this, for the people who have given encouragement, for the people like Cecil King or Dorothy Bird who've given encouragement and help along the way, and for all the other people that have contributed. With Sharon McFarland at Beachy, read a first draft and gave me so many helpful ideas of a lot of encouragement and a lot of ideas what would work and what would not.
Mm,
Um, and I'm really grateful for all of that. And I just love every once in a while, once or twice a week, I'll get a note on Facebook or an email from somebody who's read one or the other of the books and want to talk about it. And it's just wonderful. I love those opportunities to talk to people and to to hear their ideas, and to just know that there's so many people out there who love this land and love the history and love the people. And it's, well, just makes me very happy.
Well, if anybody hasn't read your book, I would certainly encourage them to do. It's a great read, especially if you love prairie history. So thanks, Joan, and we always have good conversations. This has been another one. So I'll turn it over to Rachel now. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks so much.
Thank you both so much. So I think, yeah, just thanks both of you for being here tonight and making this happen. We've got copies of the book in store. We've also got copies, so Prairie Grass as well as Looking for Edco. So we would encourage you to check those out online or give us a call tomorrow. The store opens at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, and put a copy on hold for yourself. So congratulations, Joan, and we'll see all of you later. Thanks so much for tuning in. Take care, everybody. And thanks, Sandra. Yes.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks,
Thank
Rachel.
you, Sandra.